A warm welcome also on my behalf. I know it's kind of a boring topic. I hope that you won't be too bored. But it is an important topic. That's why I want to speak about it. I will talk about essential topics that are relevant for Europe, and it's about major European topics of standardization that have effect on elevators and their components. So what all unites them are the standards and EU directives that will affect them. Let's start with the European directives and the Holden directive on machinery that will become an EU directive soon. So currently, the directive on machinery is being recasted, revised, and it is expected to be published in mid-2022 as the new EU machinery regulation. So by changing the name and the concept from regulation to a directive, this means that the national implementations in the EU states will no longer apply. This means that not every state needs to introduce it individually. However, it's rather that 30 months after entry into force, this regulation will be binding and it has to be applied in all EU member states. 42 months after entry into force, the validity of current type tests for new machines and components which were produced in accordance with the previous machinery directive will expire. This will not affect plants or products that are already installed. It refers to new installations. In 2006, we had the last directive entering into force, and it's been a few years since then. So in the directive of machinery, there were a few aspects which had to be adapted to the lift directive. So things that go a little further and things that we don't know yet, partially at least. So in the directive on machinery, they also name a software as a safety component. And this is a safety component which is essentially for the type tests for new machines and components. So it's been included into the directive. So we have a new requirement for safety of control systems. It's a big topic. So the requirements regarding artificial intelligence, AI, so especially for machines with high risk, according to Annex 1. We talked about it, and when it concerned elevators or lifts, there was nothing to be found in the directive. But with the new directive on machinery, we have in Annex 1 a list of machines which have a high risk, which means machines that are made for lifting persons or persons and good, and if there is a risk of a fall from a height of more than 3 meters. Machines from Annex 1, lifts as we know them, platform lifts, etc., in the future also are subject to a special conformity assessment procedure involving a notified body. So this can already be found in the old directive on machinery.
There is also a new requirement, or there are new requirements for economic operators regarding marketing and traceability. For example, a 5-year traceability of software changes. And they have to be traceable for 5 years in the past. One thing that has been discussed for a very long time, and many parties were in favor to improve or to increase the acceleration and the velocity or speed range, but nevertheless, things with high-speed machines, etc., with 0.15 meters per second are still the same. So there haven't been any amendments in the directive. We know them under the names EN 8141 and EN 8142. In the near future, I think they will make the decision of how to continue and how to develop the directive on machinery. The European Parliament will decide on that. Another regulation that exists as well and still applies today is the regulation on AI. So the new AI regulation will address the safety risks posed by artificial intelligent systems. So it is about the safe integration of AI systems in machinery and equipment. And it will also have an impact on elevators, as we could see in the directive on machinery. So it will have an impact on the machinery regulation and the lifts directive, if such systems are used. So here the traceability will also be obligatory, mandatory. In April of this year, the draft with annex was published, and in the first quarter of 2022 it is expected to enter into force. And then after 24 months after entry into force, it is applied, or is to be applied in all EU member states. So let's have a look then at the standards. There was an update of the EN 81 series, and it already happened, and there were publications already with our norm E81 2050 in the year 2020, and also the EN 81 72 has entered into force in 2020. In June of this year, EN 8170 has been updated, which refers to people with disabilities, and there will be a small amendment, a small addition about tableaus, etc. So in this well-known series, of course, there are some further standards on the list which will be updated or need to be updated, which is the EN 8121 for lifts in buildings, 28 for emergency calls, 58 for fire, 71 for vandalism, and 77 for earthquakes. So there is a little pressure for action. We need to act. So we need to get basically over with it so we can think of other things as well. So there will be also the transformation of EN 81-2050, and it will be then EN ISO 8100-12. So how will that happen? The valid EN 81-2050 will, something will be added, there will be an addition and an amendment so that it can be switched over or transformed into EN ISO 8100-12. So the revision of 2020 will mainly include the expansion of the component spectrum and safety-related experience from various regions of the world. Perfect. So the extension of the component spectrum includes, for example, the carrying rope diameter smaller than 8.0 millimeters, just with a small exception, because it hasn't been written yet, which is about the risk analysis and so on. It also includes alternative suspension means like belts, tooth belts, etc., ropes, and so on. So those things will also be included in the standard. So vertical doors, so refers to a lower maximum weight for handling mobile pit ladders. So in the future they may weigh kilos, 8 kilos, and that won't be a problem, but if you put a ladder, and if you have to grab a ladder which is a little far away, then maybe it's a good idea to reduce the weight accordingly. There are additional requirements for shafts and car doors, and this refers to the size of the gap. And it doesn't only refer to the shaft and car doors, but also the car lift itself, which means that between the frame and the door leaf, and refers as well to the return and the doors, to the distance between return and doors. So right now, when an accident happens, and if you have to free somebody who's trapped, and if the door is returned, then you can even harm the person even more trying to free them. So there have to be additional features, so there is not any sharp metal edge, for example, which could then hurt a person. So how will this take place? There is also a working group, of course, between the Europeans and the Chinese in order to determine the design of the standards and directives. So, when will it be published? There is already a draft of ISO 8100-12 is to be expected in the next year, and the final version then should be published in the first quarter of 2025 at the latest. I said before, of course, we have to include as many things as possible, but of course there will be differences. We have to take into account regional differences as well, for example. So in the ISO standard 8100 part 3, there will be the regional differences summarized as well. So the 81, the standard 81 won't let us alone, and we'll have a closer look. So EN 81 2050 is transformed into this whole ISO series, which then will be called the 81XX series, XX representing then the different numbers, of course. So the main standards, we already talked about them now, part 1 and 2, but another example that is very interesting for our sector here in Germany is the new DIN publication of the ISO 810030, and there will also be part 1, 2, 3, and 4. So those are the basis for the lifts which until now have been known as ISO 4190 Part 1 or DIN 1536. So the space around the lift, and we're going to go a little into detail. This is where the ISO 8101 becomes important. So the ISO 8102 becomes important here, and it deals with the electrical requirements for elevators, escalators, and moving walks. So there is a current draft, ISO, International Standards, it's called, and it's 8102-20 about on cybersecurity. And right now it still has to be commented if it needs, if there are any contradictions, for example, if there is any protest, then it has to be raised now. So the European Union is not directly involved, but the European Telecommunications Standard Institute is represented by the Digitalization and Cybersecurity Committee Working Group. Especially working in development, then this standard has to be examined closely because it's quite important. And we have to look for the main criteria here. It is about the accessibility to the installation. So it would be clear with a remote connection, for example, for the control components. And here we have a very complex admission process or approval procedure. And there we'll see if it is adopted. And then the development can be accompanied by a certifier. So keep that in mind. Furthermore, in the same group we already talked about is another draft. Besides digitalization and cybersecurity, also the electromagnetic compatibility EMC and programmable electronic systems in safety-related applications are assigned to this group of standards. So it's known as the PSRE for escalators. Oh, great, and we've come to the next group already, to 8103, and it refers to escalators and moving walks. The ISO 8104, and this deals with the improvement of the safety of existing lifts and escalators. And last but not least, ISO 8105, and it deals with lifts not yet described in the ISO series. Because we talked already about the machinery regulation, for example, so then lifts or standards like 8141 would be included here.
Ja, dann kommen wir zu einem weiteren Thema.
All right, let's come to the next topic, the work or standard accompanying directives and standards.
Ein Thema EPBD,
And one topic is the EPBD, which means Energy Performance of Buildings Directive.
Auch als EU-Gebäuderichtlinie bekannt. In der
So
Version
it's the directives
2010
on the energy performance of
wurde,
buildings.
das
In the
Thema,
version from 2020,
Aufzüge als wenig relevant ausgeklammert.
10,
Also mit der neuen
the
oder
topic of
aktuellen
elevators was
Version
still
der
excluded
Gebäuderichtlinie
because
stellt sich wieder die Frage,
it was having
wie
little
weit,
relevance. So the question would be
können
again
Aufzüge zur Verbesserung
as to
der
how far
Gesamtenergieeffizienz von
lifts
Gebäuden
can
beitragen,
improve the
beziehungsweise
overall
müssen
energy efficiency of
beitragen.
buildings.
Weil können ist ja jetzt schon möglich, insofern, wenn
They
also
can
in einer Ausschreibung steht,
right
dass
now already,
nach
so
der,
if
a
tender says
hier eine Energieklasse
that a certain energy class has to be
oder sonst was, hier
fulfilled
ausgeschrieben ist. Aber,
and so on,
es
of
geht
course they
hier
can,
eben vor allem darum,
but
wie
it's
verbindlich
especially about how
soll
binding
das werden, wann,
this
kommt's in
guideline
eine
or
Richtlinie
directive
rein
or
oder
standard
nicht.
will be.
Die ELA arbeitet aktuell ein
The
Positionspapier
ELA is working on
dazu
a
aus
positioning
und fasst
paper,
darin eine Studie zusammen,
and
die
there it
potenzielle
summarizes a
Verbesserung
study
des Energieverbrauchs von Aufzügen
showing the
im
potential
Zusammenhang
improvement
mit
in
neuen
energy
Anlagen
consumption
und
of
alten
elevators in the
mit einer
context of new installation and old elevators with a
Effizienzklasse
minimum energy
dieser,
efficiency
die
class
ISO
according
aufzeigt.
to ISO, this
Ja.
ISO standing down here.
Die ELA ist sich da, glaube ich, noch nicht
So
ganz
I think the
einig,
ELA is not
wie
really
das letzte,
sure
ähm,
about
die letzte Version dieses
how the
Papiers
final
ausschauen
version of
soll.
the paper will
Zeichnet
look
sich
like,
ein wenig ab, dass vielleicht bei
but it
2000
appears
Kilo, so ein,
that with
Schnitt
2,000
gemacht
kilograms,
wird, dass
they
unter,
have to
elektrische Aufzüge eine etwas
put
höhere
there a plate
oder
that
bessere,
electrical lifts have a
Energieeffizienzklasse
better
haben müssen.
energy efficiency
Und,
class, or that they
elektrische
have to have
Aufzüge über diese
an improved
2000
energy efficiency
Kilo,
class,
beziehungsweise
and that
alle
over
hydraulischen,
or exceeding those
Aufzüge
2,000
eben
kilos,
eine andere.
a hydraulic
Aber wie's genau
lift or
kommt,
any other
möchte ich
lift
jetzt
has to
oder
be
kann ich
used.
der ELA nicht
But
vorgreifen.
I cannot go further into detail
das Thema
and
hatten wir
anticipate
heute
what they
ja
will
auch schon.
decide on.
Sanitation Device,
We
also
already
geht
talked
hier,
about it today, the sanitation
Desinfektionseinrichtungen
device,
und
and
dergleichen.
it is
Damit,
about
also mit diesem Thema hat sich auch,
disinfection
haben sich auch
devices
unsere,
in elevators.
technischen Überwachungsvereine beziehungsweise unsere
The
EU-Notified
technical
Bodies beschäftigt. Die waren also
monitoring
im
supervision
Juni,
bodies already
beisammen
dealt
und
with
haben
it,
also hier etwas erarbeitet.
and the
Oder
committee developed
Hier mal gesehen,
a certain
was
criteria.
läuft es ab, wie wird es gemacht und welche
So they had a
Maßnahmen
look
wären
at
vielleicht
how will it
zu
look like,
ergreifen.
what would be the safe use, what measures would have to be
Die
taken.
sichere Anwendung, also gerade wenn
The
man
safe
mit
use,
einem offenen
especially working with an open UVC light in the car, then it has to be made sure that it is empty, that there is nobody inside, and that the car is secured. So you cannot just open the door when the UVC light is on and working. Inclusion in the elevator documentation, for example, the HEPA filters, we already talked a lot about air circulation, exchange, etc. So there is the necessity for modernization and retrofitting. So a new there have to be made new calculations in order to see what is the most fitting solution in the lift. So there is, for example, the opportunity in the lift to stick something up in the ceiling, but maybe it's not fit to be put there. In some countries, for example in Germany as well, there are working groups which have new insights, new findings, and then in the next session they will be included. DAFA has already done and published a lot on that. The last topic, it does not make us very happy, but the Brexit is a fact since the 1st of January 2021, but it's still not history, especially not for us. So right now we are in a transition phase from CE to UK CA, United Kingdom Conformity Assessed. So luckily, as well due to the pandemic, there was a decision from the government from the 24th of August, and it was extended for 1 year. So at the latest, it has to be applied on the 31st of December 2022. So the period will end then, and then the safety components and the testing procedure has to be applied. Of course, it is an effort. And with this new labeling, it all has to be delivered with the new labeling. Of course, there are still some open questions, because in the last few years a lot has been installed, and I can imagine that CE is found to be everywhere in Great Britain. So we have to think about spare parts, if they have to be included, and how they will deal with the problem. So they have to deliver a spare part with a similar appearance, for example, with the certificate of conformity. But sadly, there is no answer to that question yet. But we're working on it. So there are few admission offices accredited by now, so it's not easy to get everything certified from 1 minute to another. So there's a lot to be found with CE. Around 30 countries work with CE, the certificate, and many countries recognize that procedure. But for the area of Eurasia, it is overall applicable. So the United Kingdom well, they have to find out something new, and it's quite shocking, I think.
Zumindest die Maßnahme der Fristverlängerung
But may this
ein
measure
Sorry out of use
avoid a
vermeiden.
sorry out of use,
So,
at
dann
least.
bedanke ich mich für die
So,
Aufmerksamkeit.
thank you very much for listening.